So then, if you awaken from this illusion,
persistence of vision.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Persistence of Vision podcast, inspiring conversations, discussing books so that you have to read them. Today, we're very honored to welcome Daniel Mennega to the Persistence of Vision podcast to discuss the Silmarillion, and I'm very honored also to say that our super intern, Union Brooks, will be filling in for Lance Fever Myers. What have you to say for yourself, Union Brooks?
Hello. Excited to talk about some Tolkien today.
Yeah, he's excited to talk about some Tolkien. But are you, Daniel Mennega, are you excited to talk about?
Super excited. I can't wait to talk about Tolkien, talk to Union, talk to LB, dork out on elves, orcs, everything before that, the Nazgul, the beginning of the Nazgul. You name it, LB, I'm onto it.
Dork out? How can you call this dorky? This is a book about elves and dwarves.
I mean, this is the foundational textbook of dork, isn't it? Dork orc?
Dork orc.
I mean, come on.
Oh, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't been to our website, POV-Publishing.com, then you are a goddamn fool. Because that is the place to go and read The Goddamn Fool, or at least order it. To order Why So Much, to order Lance's new book, the zombie book about the holidays, which is so wonderful and everyone loves. And what else can I say? Go to the POV-Publishing.com website. So, Daniel, sorry to interrupt you with that station identification.
Nope.
Why don't you tell us what in the world is the Silmarillion?
Well, the Silmarillion, I think, better be defined by the Silmaril, the rings, or actually these little stones. They're precious jewels that were made in a long, long time ago, LB. Long before our great-grandfather or anything like that. But essentially, these precious stones were so powerful that they not only moved people to do great acts, they moved one elf to make a great oath a long, long time ago. An oath. A great oath where he made a claim that he would never rest, nor would his sons live until he had avenged a certain event. I don't remember exactly what it was. I think it was the theft of these jewels I mentioned.
A crime. A
crime of some sort, like almost like a Hearst type of bank robbery, if you will.
Yikes.
But long, long time ago, a bad man named Melkor ran away with the Silmaril and created an epic called the Silmarillion.
Now, I saw the Avengers movies. It sounds like that has pretty much the same plot, right? The jewels have to go into the glove.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that people know that's almost 101 as far as, haven't read any scholarship, LB, but 10 to 1, 98% of the scholarship out there on Lord of the Rings is comparative literature. Comparative literature? I would guess. Maybe 80%, let's be fair.
Mm-hmm. What is comparative literature?
Well, it would probably just be, in my definition for this purpose, just exploring how every single thing that's written relates to everything else that's been written.
I thought that was probably one of the more interesting themes of this book, is that how mythology plays a huge part in the shaping of languages. And I actually had a realization reading it last night that this is actually a mythos explaining how the elvish language came to be, the made-up language by J.R.R. Tolkien.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's my understanding of it, too. And you summarized the gist of the separation between the elves and men is the language. In fact, near the end of the Silmarillion, when things are getting really, really bad, especially for men who have turned away from the good, so to speak, the way that we distinguish those men are that they don't have anything to do with elvish tongue. They totally reject it. They are not allowed to speak it. If they do, they get sacrificed.
All right, let's take a quick step back, though, here. What is the relationship? We know the author of this book is J.R.R. Tolkien. And he's more famous for The Hobbit and for The Lord of the Rings, unless I'm terribly mistaken. What is the relationship between those books, those novels, and the Silmarillion?
I mean, the way I see it, it's kind of like you're reading the Silmarillion, and it's a big old book and you've used it as a doorstop for many years. You finally dug into it, and about halfway through, there's a little paragraph that says, "And Bilbo begat Frodo, and Frodo from the Shire went down and destroyed the Ring of Power in Mount Doom." It's like it's the Silmarillion is an umbrella story. It's a much bigger story. It's a
bigger story.
It's, you can think about even the Lord of the Rings. You could think about as a tale within not just a novel, but a saga.
A saga. So, and it seems to me that Tolkien was very interested in the speaking of sagas with the Norse myths. Was that accurate?
I bet he would be. Just given the nature of the shipbuilding and the seafaring and all the things. And I was reading something the other day in one of the sections about the elves. They cruised across the ocean without wind or without sails or oars. That kind of thing. So it sort of evokes a mythic Nordic seafaring ability. But I don't know much more about the scholarship. Do you?
I mean, from what I was gathering from Wikipedia, Tolkien seemed like he was a master of several languages, multilinguistic, studied Old English, spoke Finnish, Spanish, and 4 other languages.
It's amazing.
And from what I heard, a lot of his whole thought for these books, or what was the saga of the Lord of the Rings, was just a linguistic development for his language. And he even has said the languages came first, and the stories described the languages for why they existed.
So he would come up with linguistic concepts and back characters and stories, and out of that linguistic passion.
Right.
That's sort of an amazing way to create. But
yeah, to me, this book actually changed my concept of my whole opinion on all mythologies, which is I never gave much mythologies any credit for what they're worth, but seeing how something like this has such a profound influence over the history of the people, their language, their culture, it just highlights overall how all mythology has a huge significance to people.
Completely, and you probably find the same thing, both of you, is that the stories are always the same. And like you mentioned with the Avengers, and this idea of vengeance, all the big themes, Tolkien doesn't step around romance. It's full of it, Luthien and Beren, and all the love stories that are intrinsic to that. So all the big themes are there, and I think what you're saying is the language is what ties it together. Right. Near the end, especially with the kings of Numenor that rebel, and I don't want to get too into the weeds. I think I'd like people to try to read this or just to finish it. But these kings at the very end, I think, are most interesting to me. And I mentioned to you, LB, that last section I can't ever pronounce. It's called the Akalabeth. Is after a lot of the elven myths, but it's near the end where all the men and women, I assume, are at their apex of power, and the Numenorians, they've got the most influence of Manwë. The gods and different elves have had great influence on them. They're at their peak of their power, and they decide to seek the gift that they see elves having, which is life everlasting, and they see death as something that they fear, and they more and more become afraid of death. Yes. And so it's kind of a human story.
Yes, and the elves have the opposite perspective, where they see their immortality as a bit of a burden. Isn't that right?
Yeah, actually, that's.
But the book itself it seems to at least begin as a kind of creation myth for the entire world that Tolkien envisions.
Right. It starts out as the entire world. The first 5 or 6 pages, maybe more than that, seem like Genesis, but then he zeroes in on Ea, which you can probably guess what that is, a stand-in for Arda, which is another, I guess, Germanic rendition he gives and names this world. And then he zeroes in on his firstborn, he calls the elves, and then the secondborn, which is his greatest creation, something that he wanted to have just so and cared a lot for because they had choices. It's sort of biblical, obviously. But I like the fighting.
The fighting is good. Well, when we go back to Greek mythology, we certainly find that the distinction is there as well between the immortals and the mortals, and the human beings are defined largely by the fact that they are mortal, that this is the single defining characteristic of human beings in, say, Homer, and it is the thing that, they're referred to as mortals. They're not referred to as humans as much. So this is a juxtaposition we see again in the Tolkien with these two races.
Yeah, completely. And and that I think is the theme. Not to summarize it and be glib about summarizing this book, but that seems to be the theme. In that is this struggle to come to grips with the fact that things pass away, and all throughout the book, all the characters lose things, either spouses or loved ones, sons, jewels, and they are unable to accept that things have passed away. And ultimately, I think that's the central theme of the book. Not that we're looking for it, but there's something I wrote down, and as I read this, just to prepare a little bit. These men were high thinkers. They were not afraid of death. The Númenóreans, they had never been that way until Melkor Morgoth, who was Sauron's boss, came in and started to plant seeds of jealousy of the elves who could live forever.
And Sauron is the villain from Lord of the Rings.
Right. He's kind of, in this book, he plays Melkor Morgoth's pupil, kind of he's a student learning the ways of evil and doing a pretty good job. So he just says, even the faithful did not wholly escape from the affliction of their people, and they were troubled by the thought of death. And it just goes and fuels the whole story. Is their attempt to gain immortality.
There also seems to be a recurring theme where the most powerful are also the most susceptible to corruption or evil. And what significance do you think that plays out in the whole, or what is the meaning of that?
For sure, yeah. And I thought about that a little bit too, only because, you've got these Númenóreans who are so badass that after people are scattered throughout Middle-earth, they go into Middle-earth and help people and teach them to raise crops and make plows and so on. Later on, they rule over them. Later on, they enslave them and sacrifice them, but that's beside the point. I'm thinking to myself, how do they come back and kindle anything that would take back the good side of things? And you think about Frodo and so on. It would never be done by somebody powerful. It would have to be somebody, probably agrarian. Yeah, it's a great question.
The themes of good and evil are very much of the time, aren't they? I suppose good and evil exist throughout history, but certainly the 20th century, the early 20th century, the First World War, the interwar period, and the Second World War, these are the times during which Tolkien is writing these. And, a lot of people draw comparisons between the Lord of the Rings and the Second World War, the fight against the Nazis. Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's interesting and important to consider as you go into this book, or is it more...
Yeah, for me, I actually hadn't thought about that very much, the tide of the war, but absolutely there's those themes, and I think the other is a big theme with Tolkien, just like it was with Lewis, and I talked about scholarship earlier, that I haven't really read any scholarship that I can think of at all on this book, as far as outside of fan fiction or things like that. But again, I think that most of the scholarship is probably about either Complet or about more of a Marxist approach, or just maybe saying how Tolkien is really betrays his times by making the Middle East almost like a stand-in for Mordor and
the Middle East,
and just like Lewis did with the Klormans, who are obviously from Turkey and south of there, where it becomes more of resembling the Crusades than World War II in my mind. But they are all interesting archetypes that England has hung on to. Seems like in literature, and we have too, but still. Now
the Lord of the Rings. One thing we discussed with another guest of ours, David Moses Fruchter, was the book he was discussing, the Illuminatus trilogy. He felt was given short shrift by critics and even perhaps by audiences because it was part of the science fiction genre, or it was marketed that way. Do you think that Tolkien, I mean, there's no question of the enormous success of this book in terms of sales, in terms of the fact that it's been made into movies, or not the Silmarillion perhaps, but is there a sense, do you have, that the academic world and the critical world may underestimate this book?
I think they probably do, but I don't think they do it for literary reasons or even for subject matter. I think we're moving away. I think we're becoming more open to ideas of giving critical credence to books that have a science fictional or a fantastic approach. Things like, or even historical fiction is an example of a type of book that would never have gotten critical acclaims. Things like Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel and Bring Up the Bodies and other Booker Prize winners, who are historical fiction, is generally considered, right next to romance.
That's true. And I always like to point out that War and Peace is historical fiction, and of course it's not as good a reputation as any book written.
Yeah, and so there's hope, and my intent wouldn't even be to necessarily defend the Silmarillion as some sort of worthy of academic scholarship. I think it probably is. I mean, I spent the last few days in the latter parts of Silmarillion, and it's amazingly written in a way that just makes me want to throw the book against the wall. Every 5 or 6 sentences, I want to rip it apart. I get so moved by it, and it's so amazing. I reread it, write it down. And still very, very moving. So I think, as far as a passionate book goes, go ahead, please.
I think one of the things that most people criticize for it is how confusing it is. As far as there's 3 different names for the same species or person, but I think that's probably what gives it such high esteem as fantasy, because this is sort of taken as a translation of old Elvish tales, and then all the different sectors of elves' tales coming together would be the explanation for why there are so many different names or different words to describe the same thing.
Completely. I didn't know. It escaped me for a moment that these are exactly the gathered tales told by the elves. These are the elven tales, and that the good guys would sit around and tell these and sing these tales in Lord of the Rings about Elendil and Elbereth and all these heroes from the elven days that we learn about in the Silmarillion. But your point about that, these are the tales that written by the elves, and that's why these names. The human name means one thing, the elven name means another thing, the Eldrin name means another thing. There's a dark tongue name that means another thing, and the more you understand the differences between those names, you uncover a nuanced richness that you would never know if you didn't have those 2 names, so it's amazing. And at the end, like I was saying, this guy El-Farazzo refused to be called by his elvish name because he was in rebellion against that. He'd probably take his orcish name as well. But very, very good point, Union.
I also wonder if there wasn't like some final version written in plain Elvish that some super nerd would tear apart in hopes of understanding even more nuance of what this book represents.
I'm sure that there's a group of fans working on that right now. It's probably near completion. It's probably beautiful. It's probably well written. I think especially if you take the best fiction that takes an elven perspective, which the last third of the book I think is definitely an elvish perspective, even though it's looking down at the fall of Numenor, the upheaval that leads to Middle Earth, and the need for this savior Bilbo.
Well, it's funny. in a letter, I believe, that is published at the beginning of the book, that Tolkien wrote to a friend, he mentions as an aside that the word elf is a bad translation into English of what the elves really are. And it's certainly true that in my experience of elves from other genres and other works, we think of elves as little tiny, cute, maybe scary, but not very serious, like Santa Claus.
Imps.
A jolly little elf. And and what Tolkien is creating here is very different from that. He's talking about beings that are the size of human beings, but they're much more beautiful. They're immortal. They have incredible, exquisite magic.
Yeah, they have all sorts of supernatural abilities. They have mental plasticity and elasticity that allows them to think and just circles around everybody. They have, but all some of the traditional things too. I mean, he tapped into a lot of elven myths. Not that I know many of them. I'm kind of spinning here when it comes to elves, other than the ones I've learned from Tolkien. And I don't know if Lewis had any elves, but I'm not that versed on elves besides the Sindarin.
C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia.
Were there elves in that?
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah. But I've exhausted the extent of my knowledge outside of Tolkien. But those elves were great. I mean, they were wise. They were also kinetic and telepathic. They could live forever.
Crazy. And the bad guys are elves too, right?
I think so. And they're talking about the bad guys, the orcs and the
orcs.
Yeah, and just
Sauron, isn't he like a dark fallen elf or something?
Sauron is in the echelon of deities.
Oh, he's a deity.
And he's in the same echelon as I think Gandalf, who is a Maiar, and he sits beneath. It's like a corporation. Just all these layers of bureaucracy.
Speaking of this, it's very, very interesting to consider the tendency in certain types of fiction, especially science fiction, especially fantasy, the extent and the application of imagination in creating whole worlds, right? We have, when you read a great novel, you don't usually think of it as creating an entire world. You think I'm talking about something like, I don't know, not Kurt Vonnegut maybe, but like Nabokov. He wrote Lolita. Well, that book is set in the United States of America in the 1950s, and the world he creates is the world of a few characters living in the world that we all share. Whereas someone like Tolkien has created such a vast culture. There are maps, there are cultures, there are, as you said, he created whole languages in order to do this. And so what you find is that a culture revolves around it, where there are people who spend their lives studying these made-up worlds.
Just the topography of Middle-earth is probably a doctorate, because you have, like you said, LB, not only did he create this whole world, and he destroyed it twice, completely. He had twice in the Silmarillion, at the end of Lord of the Rings, he destroys it, and then, so it's, and not for any good reason. It just, he could have resolved it, built a couple borders, maybe had a flood to cover something, but no, just completely annihilates and turns it inside out, and then creates a whole new world with new beings, new languages. Can't explain it. Genius, maybe. I don't know. Caffeine.
I remember reading an interview with the other RR, George R.R. Martin. I assumed he took that RR thing from Tolkien.
Or ran with it.
Or ran with it anyway. But he was comparing his works, the Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire books, which we're familiar with from the TV show, if not from the books. He said, well, in Tolkien versus my books, he said in Tolkien you'll have a reference to a good king who had a good reign, and that people were happy during this reign. And he says, in my book, there are no good kings. There are only deeply flawed individuals that are more or less depraved, Do you think that's fair?
I do. I think that the archetypes, I think that's, if you mention anything about let's say, to put it in the old terms, the Silmarillion's place in the canon, I think these flattened, large, good characters hurt the traction of a book like Silmarillion to really touch people over a long period of time, that on themes that don't have to do with the temporal things like politics or, that's a different thing. So in that way, R. Martin has a better chance of surviving in the canon, believe it or not, only because it's, let me cancel that. I think because writing talent and other things have a lot to do with it. But on storytelling alone, I think Martin is a very, very good storyteller. He pulls the pages and is a good storyteller, kind of like you'd make the same case for Stephen King or somebody else like that.
As I understood, Tolkien is known as like the grandfather of modern fantasy, or what we come to think of as modern fantasy, because he's one of the first writers to create such an expansive universe, totally of mythology, versus what seemed to be the standard olden fairy tales. It almost seemed sort of childish in a lot of ways.
Okay.
What do you think? What do you think led him to? I suppose
probably dissatisfaction with that, and a fascination with what had come before, and a brilliant mind, and a desire to assimilate it all in a way that was entertaining to him, probably first and foremost, as children. And then the war maybe fueled a metaphor for him, an analogy that he could work with. But yeah, it's amazing. It's a first of a kind, other than the Bible, let's say.
Yes. Well, I certainly I wasn't trying to say when I brought up World War I and World War II that the works of Tolkien were reducible to analogies for those wars. But it certainly is also true that we are talking about a frame of reference for people who grew up during that time that's simply not accessible to us except through books. Tolkien would have been around in England when a whole generation was decimated, where it was a perfectly normal thing to die when you're 18 because of this war. And so it's interesting to think about his books, which are so full of apocalyptic themes, the constant threat of, as you said, he destroyed the world twice in his books. He's reminding us that what we may have experienced personally is not the limit of what can go wrong.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely, and I think that's interesting. I hadn't thought about today's audiences, so to speak, or people who hadn't read it, or anybody younger than me, really, whose parents didn't grow up in a time of war. I know that we have conflict today. I think, without romanticizing the World War II, had a little bit more of an impact on the people that influenced this book. So that's a clumsy way of saying I think it is a little bit political and for its times, but I think that, again, it could be imprinted upon just about any large conflict or any large event that involves human themes as a book. That's what draws the book to me to this day, is that things pass away. The theme you mentioned is that's the common theme. And these monumental upheavals, and I'm not going to say it's didactic in the sense that this is what he's trying to tell us, but it's just a major theme. That's the sooner we come to grips with the fact that things pass away, the more content we'll be, perhaps.
So that's a great point you're bringing up, though. Is like, why should we read this book? That's the question. And for their listeners at home, I would imagine some of them, at least, are picking up on the difficulty of this book, the expansive nature of its contents, to the point where it almost sounds like you'd have to study it rather than just read it. Is that true? And what brought you to it?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I'm glad I had a chance to kind of qualify that, because I really intended not to talk about it in the sense of the bigger academic themes, which, like I said, I'm not interested in that as much, but more about the fun. I mean, the fun times I had to read it. For me personally, it was inspired by the Peter Jackson movies, and I hadn't. I think I saw Lord of the Rings, and I thought, wow, when I saw those, and I'd read Lord of the Rings, but I'd never had it. I'd read Lord of the Rings a few times, but I'd never just seeing. Especially, I was fascinated by the Nazgul, because I thought that's just a cool concept. That's just badass. These really bad guys, and then as the movie progresses, you learn a little bit more. You see visions of them, and their appearance was so well done. I was captivated by them and wanted to know more about them, and that drew me to the Silmarillion, where I learned about them. And that was what was the story there.
One of them, I really struggled reading this, and one of the easier things about reading it now versus when it came out is there are so many articles and Wikipedias online that explain Lord of the Rings, and I had to stop every other page to look up a character or person, and it's just so incredibly expansive. I feel like some people do spend most of their lives trying to study and understand these works. And,
I would suggest that you don't read any scholarship and open the book and start reading it. And I would, the first little bit about the creation story is a little bit dense, but if you just recognize it as that, almost immediately you have the major story take place and unfold, and from that point on, it's all run and gun. It's all battles. It's all dragons and spiders and everything else.
Union, do you see the skies darkening over this recording studio right now? Do you
I feel
the gathering of clouds?
The clouds of Mordor are starting to
charged energy in the air. Because I think it's time for the lightning round.
Lightning round!
Oh no, Mount Doom is shuddering.
Right. Are you ready?
I'm ready, always.
When was the first time you fell in love with a book?
Pokey Little Puppy. Pokey Little Puppy.
Pokey Little Puppy.
The Pokey Little Puppy. It's a story about a little puppy who drank too much milk, and I couldn't stop reading it. And sure, it was a couple years ago, but still. Now, this is as a 5-year-old, I remember the book well. I'm sure my sisters do. Everybody does. I carried it around like a blankie. Yeah.
Awesome. Has a book ever changed your mind?
I think so. I think I've seen a different perspective. I read a book called The Beach as one of my first books that I read that was a novel past the comic book, maybe when I was in 9th grade or so. And the theme of it was the atomic conflict. And I learned some things about that idea that influenced me. I don't know if that's exactly changing my mind, but it's definitely influenced my decision making.
Comic conflict. What is comic conflict?
Comic conflict?
Atomic conflict.
Oh, atomic. Oh, you're talking about On the Beach?
Mm-hmm.
On the Beach.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I left the on off, didn't I? Yeah, okay.
Has a book ever changed your life?
Oh, yeah. Many books. Every book I read in some way changes my life. I mean, the power ones do, of course. Infinite Jests. This to an extent that it shaped my direction and my interests. The Silmarillion did. Absolutely.
Fantastic. Has a book ever made you cry?
I mean, I've welled up plenty of times. I don't think I've read a book and dropped it and cried. I've welled up and dripped over and been moved. Does that count?
Sure.
Okay. All right, good.
Can you name a book you've read more than once?
I can name a couple books.
Some off the top of your head?
One that makes sense. Let's say Pokey Little Puppy. Yeah.
Puppy. And the big one. Do you have any poetry committed to memory?
I used to have some Emily Dickinson, and let me think if I can find that. Let me not to the impediments of true love admit.
Let me not to the marriage of two
True
minds.
minds admit impediments. There it is. And that's it. So that was like, I think, from 4th grade.
We'll take that as a maybe.
Next time I'll have a whole sonnet for you.
All right, Daniel, do we have any closing remarks on this book or about yourself or your life or anything coming up for you that you would like to share with the people at home?
It's been a blast. LB Union, it's been a good time. It's my very, very first podcast, and I think I want to do it again. I love it. I'm having a blast. It's very energizing, and that's really it. I can encourage people to pick this book up. Don't be intimidated by it. If you need to, jump to the chapter on Beren and Luthien. If you understand that there are good guys and bad guys, and if you take that with a grain of salt, you'll be in there in no time. Riding an undead dragon. And other than that, LB, people can follow me on Instagram. That'd be great. I've got a lot of cool things there at Mennega.
Mennega.
Yeah, one word. And other than that, just
if you're not already following,
well, of course, I've got a couple slots left.
With you. We are very happy to have had you here today, Mr. Mennega, and I personally have been quite touched and honored to have our super intern, Union Brooks, as my co-pilot in this great interview. The book, again, is J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion, and we encourage you to read it. We encourage you to become a fanatic for it and to lose your mind and believe that it's real.
Go for it. Get into it.
Go for it. And once again, we're going to ask you to go to POV-Publishing.com, not for our sake, to be sure, but for yours. Because we hate to see you embarrass yourself by not going to POV-Publishing.com. Thank you. Union, any last words?
Don't forget to check out Lance Myers' A Clash of the Christmas Clones.
Clash of the Christmas Clones is the book. Buy it on our site.
Miss you, Lance.
Yes. Daniel was sorry to not be able to talk to Lance, but he was very pleased to talk to Union. I'm reading Daniel.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everyone, and good night.